Follow the money. Russia cannot afford peace. Ironically, because it can't afford war either, but peace would basically bring this whole house of cards tumbling down. So this article gets a little bit in the weeds. Don't get me wrong, it's great, but I think I can explain it pretty simply. I also think it's fascinating because it kind of shows how classic metrics of a strong economy don't always show the full picture. But I think it's important to understand because Putin's not interested in peace. Not long-term peace anyway. And if an agreement were to be struck with Ukraine, no matter how many concessions were made for Russia, I can pretty much guarantee you that he would have to find another way of continuing this propped up economy. So despite bragging about Russia's economy for the last couple of years, it's not quite that simple. The claim is that despite immediately following the invasion, Russia's GDP shrank by 1.2. It rebounded by 3.6 in 2023 and 2024. And if I've already lost you, GDP is basically the measure of how much money is being exchanged in an economy. The idea is that if a lot of money is being spent, that's a good economy. Personally, I think it's a ridiculous way of measuring an economy. As we know, it does not tell the full picture, but whatever. Leaders love to use it for bragging rights. The issue is what type of money is being spent and where. If you've ever cracked open a history book, then you know that war is often good for business domestically, because a lot of manufacturing has to go towards sustaining wartime efforts. So as long as there's a need, the demand can be filled domestically, factories and whatnot. And right now, military spending accounts for 8% of Russia's GDP and 40% of the federal government budget. And that's according to official figures that apparently, according to this article, don't even capture all defense-related spending. So despite even like a ceasefire, if the expectation is that Russia will continue military operations long-term, that percentage of the GDP will continue to be spent. If permanent peace were achieved, a significant portion of that spending would just... To be clear, this doesn't require the current military operations to continue, but it could be replaced by another. As a result of having such a heated economy, inflation is on the rise in Russia. And in order to try to stem inflation, they have been increasing interest rates. The central bank's benchmark rate is at 21%. And you thought it was high in America at like 4.5. You're not sure why interest rates are raised to combat inflation. Basically, they want to make it more expensive for banks and companies to borrow money to slow the flow of money a little bit. Inflation is a normal part of any economy, at least a small amount. You want your money to be worth more today than it is tomorrow to encourage you to spend it today and not tomorrow. You don't want that cycle to go too fast because then holding on to money is worthless and investing in the country and stuff is pointless because your money will just lose value too quickly. Anyway, despite the interest rates intended to slow down lending, at the same time, since 2022, banks have been required to finance companies from the defense sector at subsidized rates. So basically, if your company has anything to do with like a wartime effort, or if you can claim that it does, or loans get subsidized, which increases the likelihood of these companies taking out a loan that they can't actually afford without these subsidies or preferred rates. Now, preferential loans have made up about 16% of the bank's total portfolios, and the demand for whatever they're creating is gone. They're going to be carrying a bunch of debt. There's a good chance that a chunk of them won't be able to actually pay back the money that they loaned. They're going to have to default. And considering how much of that makes up the bank's portfolios, that would also be bad for the banks. In the meantime, state-owned banks have made huge profits, but they're also taking on more debt more quickly. So the ratio of the debt to their capital is going up. They have less cash on hand in comparison. And now GDP growth is actually slowing. Even though a lot of the defense industry is under the Kremlin's control, so technically military companies will probably not be defaulting. There are a lot of ancillary companies affected by this, and then there's also every other company that is dealing with these increased interest rates. To the point where at least one think tank close to the Kremlin estimated that 20% of manufacturing businesses spent the equivalent of 2/3 or more of their operating profit on their debts, compared with 10% a year earlier. So if any of these manufacturing businesses experience a slowdown, that's going to put them in a lot of trouble. The other big issue is that even though they can tout an unemployment rate of around 2%, it's actually because they don't have enough workers. The civilian industry is operating at barely 80% of capacity. And while it's not entirely due to military operations, it is exacerbated by the fact that so many soldiers are being sent away. But even returning all the troops and the 600,000 workers hired in the military sector would not immediately fix the issue because most of them lack the skills needed in the civilian economy. The other thing is that because fewer people are interested in enlisting, they keep dumping more and more money into the already overheated economy in order to try to incentivize more soldiers to sign up. So shrinking those numbers would help, but that doesn't seem like the plan. In fact, he wants to grow the army to 1.5 million active troops, making it the second in size worldwide. So the reason I discovered that article is because this one by the Irish Star actually just came across my feed. This one is talking about mortgage costs and mass layoffs being caused by the incredibly high interest rates. I think it helps fill in some of the final blanks. At first, with inflation and higher interest rates, wages were increasing. People had higher mortgage costs, so they expected higher pay. But now these companies that are saddled with so much debt have to start cutting their workforce. They don't have the profit margin to continue increasing workers' salaries. And apparently several companies are discussing reductions of up to 40 to 50% of contracted staff. And these set of layoffs will probably affect white-collar workers more than blue-collar. So what does this mean? Russia can't afford being in a war anymore, but it also can't afford not to be. Its biggest saving grace would be lifted sanctions on its energy sector, which, by the way, is why certain people at the US are looking to do that. However, Europe is not likely to follow suit, it sounds like. They have trust issues. So I'm willing to bet that the current solution is to keep the war or a war waging as long as possible so that there isn't an immediate contraction and collapse of the economy, while working to once again make others dependent on Russian resources or resources it acquires. This isn't a particularly revolutionary idea, obviously, but just don't expect Russia to stop engaging in any sort of warfare anytime soon. It's the only thing that's keeping it running on fumes.